The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her equipment belt one final time. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that revealed determined brown eyes. The weight of her tactical vest felt familiar now, after 3 years of specialized training that most people would never know existed. She had arrived at Naval Base Coronado at 0530 hours, 30 minutes before her scheduled appointment with Captain James Morrison. The meeting had been arranged through channels she rarely used anymore. Channels that connected her current work with her past life in ways that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Today marked the beginning of something she had both hoped for and dreaded since leaving active duty. The base hummed with morning activity. Sailors moved with purpose between buildings, their crisp uniforms catching the California breeze. Sarah watched them through the window of the administrative building where she waited, remembering when she had worn that same uniform with pride. That felt like a lifetime ago, before everything changed, before she discovered abilities she never knew she possessed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the private military contractor where she now worked. "Remember, you're there as a consultant only. No mention of Project Blackwater unless specifically asked." She deleted the message immediately, a habit that had become second nature over the past year. The door to Captain Morrison's office opened, and a stern-faced man in his 50s emerged. His silver hair was cut in a precise military style, and his blue eyes held the kind of intensity that came from decades of making life and death decisions. Behind him followed a younger officer, Lieutenant Commander Davis, whose skeptical expression made it clear he questioned why this civilian woman was taking up their valuable time. "Ms. Martinez," Captain Morrison said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I understand you have some unique qualifications that might be relevant to our current training challenges." Sarah shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze. "That's correct, sir. Though I should mention that some of my experience comes from classified operations that I can only discuss in general terms." Lieutenant Commander Davis shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, Captain, I'm still not clear on why we need outside help with SEAL training. Our instructors are the best in the world." Captain Morrison gestured for them to move toward the training facility. "Commander Davis raises a fair point, Ms. Martinez. Our SEAL teams are indeed trained by the most elite instructors available. What exactly can you offer that we don't already have?" As they walked across the base, Sarah chose her words carefully. "Sir, my background includes specialized training in high-stress psychological conditioning and advanced interrogation resistance. I've worked with units that operate in environments where traditional military training isn't sufficient." The three of them approached a large concrete building that Sarah recognized as one of the SEAL training facilities. Through the windows, she could see groups of candidates engaged in various exercises. Some were running obstacle courses, others were in swimming pools practicing underwater operations, and still others were in classrooms receiving tactical instruction. "These men have already passed basic underwater demolition/SEAL training," Captain Morrison explained. "They're preparing for advanced deployment. What we've found is that despite their exceptional physical conditioning and technical skills, some struggle when faced with certain psychological pressures in the field." Lieutenant Commander Davis opened the facility door for them. "We've had incidents where perfectly trained SEALs have been compromised not because they lacked skill or courage, but because they encountered interrogation techniques or psychological warfare methods that their training hadn't prepared them for." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. The enemy has evolved their methods. Traditional resistance training assumes conventional interrogation techniques. Modern psychological warfare uses methods that can break even the strongest minds if they're not specifically prepared. They entered a hallway lined with briefing rooms and equipment storage areas. The sound of intense physical training echoed from the gymnasium ahead. Captain Morrison stopped at a door marked Briefing Room C and turned to face Sarah. "That's exactly right," he said. "We need someone who can teach our teams to recognize and resist these newer psychological manipulation techniques. Your file suggests you have experience in this area." Sarah felt the familiar weight of secrets she couldn't fully share. "I do, sir. But I need to be upfront about something. The training methods I use are intense. They push people to psychological limits that some consider extreme." Lieutenant Commander Davis frowned. Our SEALs are used to extreme training. Not like this, Sarah replied quietly. Physical extreme is different from psychological extreme. What I teach involves breaking down mental barriers that most people don't even know they have. It requires complete trust and absolute commitment from both instructor and student. Captain Morrison studied her face carefully. Are you suggesting our SEALs might not be ready for your methods? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I'm suggesting that what I teach changes people permanently. Once you learn to see the vulnerabilities in your own mind, you can never unsee them. Some people find that liberating. Others find it terrifying. They entered the briefing room, where a large table was surrounded by chairs and walls lined with tactical diagrams and training schedules. Captain Morrison gestured for Sarah to sit, then took the seat across from her while Lieutenant Commander Davis remained standing, his skepticism clearly growing. Tell us about your background, Captain Morrison said. Your file has some gaps that we'd like you to fill in. Sarah had prepared for this question, though she dreaded it every time. I enlisted in the Navy at 18. Initially trained as an intelligence specialist, but was selected for a special program after 2 years. The program involved working with captured enemy personnel to understand their training and psychological conditioning methods. She paused, watching their reactions. During that work, I discovered that I had an unusual ability to understand how psychological pressure affects different personality types. I could predict with remarkable accuracy which interrogation methods would be most effective against specific individuals. Lieutenant Commander Davis finally sat down, his interest clearly piqued despite his reservations. That's a useful skill for intelligence work, but how does it translate to training our people? Because the same understanding that helps break someone down can be used to build them up, Sarah explained. If you know exactly where someone's psychological weaknesses are, you can design training that specifically strengthens those areas. Captain Morrison leaned forward. Give us an example. Sarah considered how much she could safely reveal. Most people have a core fear that they've never fully confronted. For some, it's the fear of being abandoned. For others, it's the fear of being powerless or helpless. Traditional military training teaches you to overcome fear through discipline and courage, which works well for obvious external threats. She stood and moved to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. But psychological warfare targets those core, hidden fears. It doesn't matter how brave you are if the enemy finds a way to trigger your deepest psychological vulnerability. She drew a simple diagram showing a circle labeled conscious mind, surrounded by smaller circles labeled with various fears. My training methods identify these hidden vulnerabilities and then systematically expose the trainee to them in a controlled environment until they develop genuine immunity. Lieutenant Commander Davis studied the diagram. That sounds like psychological torture. It can be, Sarah admitted. The difference is consent and purpose. Torture is designed to break someone down permanently. My training breaks people down temporarily so they can rebuild themselves stronger. Captain Morrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the training yard. How long does this process take? That depends on the individual and how many vulnerabilities we're addressing. Some people have only 1 or 2 major psychological weak points. Others have complex networks of interconnected fears and insecurities. The training can take anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months. And what's your success rate? Captain Morrison asked. Sarah hesitated. This was where the conversation always became difficult. 100% completion rate for those who finish the program. However, not everyone chooses to finish. Lieutenant Commander Davis turned to face her. What do you mean? About 30% of trainees choose to withdraw once they fully understand what the training involves. It's completely voluntary, and there's no shame in deciding it's not right for you. But those who complete it become essentially immune to psychological manipulation of any kind. Captain Morrison returned to his seat. I need to ask you a direct question, Ms. Martinez. Are you telling us that you can train our SEALs to be completely resistant to any form of psychological pressure? Sarah met his gaze. Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm telling you. But there's a price. The training changes how they see the world, how they relate to other people, how they understand themselves. Some find that change positive. Others find it isolating. The room fell silent as both officers considered her words. Finally, Captain Morrison spoke. We'd like you to conduct a demonstration training session with one of our teams. If it proves effective, we'll discuss a broader implementation." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, I need to be clear about something. A demonstration session isn't really possible with these methods. You can't partially expose someone to this type of training. Once we begin, the trainee either completes the full process or withdraws. There's no middle ground." Lieutenant Commander Davis looked alarmed. "You're asking us to commit an entire SEAL team to an experimental training program without knowing what it involves." "I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing," Sarah replied. "But I understand if that's not possible. This type of training requires complete faith in the process, which is why I usually work only with volunteers who specifically request it." Captain Morrison stood again, his decision-making process clearly visible on his face. "How many SEALs would you work with for this demonstration?" "Ideally, no more than 6. The training is extremely personal and intensive. Large groups don't work." "And how long would it take?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "For weeks minimum, possibly 6 if we encounter complications. And, sir, I need to emphasize again that some of these men might choose not to complete the program once they understand what it requires." Lieutenant Commander Davis shook his head. "This sounds too risky. We can't afford to have SEALs dropping out of training or being psychologically damaged by experimental methods." "With respect, Commander," Sarah said, "they're already being damaged by inadequate preparation for modern psychological warfare. What I'm offering is a solution to a problem you've acknowledged exists." Captain Morrison moved to his desk and picked up a folder. "I'm going to arrange for you to observe one of our current training sessions. I want you to see our men in action, and I want them to see you. Then, we'll make a decision about moving forward." Sarah nodded. "That's acceptable, sir. But I should warn you that observation works both ways. Your men will be evaluating me, but I'll also be evaluating them. Not every SEAL is psychologically suited for this type of advanced training." As they prepared to leave the briefing room, Lieutenant Commander Davis asked one final question. "Ms. Martinez, what made you leave active duty to do this kind of work?" Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "I discovered that the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones shooting at you, Commander. They're the ones who can make you shoot at yourself." The three of them walked toward the main training facility, where Sarah would get her first look at the SEALs she might soon be teaching to face their deepest fears. She had no way of knowing that one of those men would change the course of her life forever, or that her own hidden vulnerabilities were about to be tested in ways she never expected. The gymnasium erupted with the controlled chaos of elite military training as Sarah followed Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Commander Davis through the entrance. 24 SEALs were engaged in various exercises designed to test both physical endurance and mental toughness. The air smelled of sweat and determination, punctuated by the sharp commands of instructors pushing already exceptional men to their limits. Sarah's eyes immediately began cataloging what she observed, a skill developed through years of psychological assessment. She watched how each man responded to pressure, noting subtle signs of stress, confidence, and underlying personality traits that most people would miss. Her training had taught her to read people like open books, and these SEALs were no exception. Near the far wall, a group of 6 men was engaged in a particularly intense exercise. They were attempting to solve a complex tactical puzzle while instructors deliberately created distractions and applied psychological pressure. Sarah recognized the exercise as a standard test of cognitive function under stress, but she also saw immediately how it could be improved. "That's Team 7, Captain Morrison explained, following her gaze. "They're preparing for deployment in 3 months. These men have been together for 2 years and have an excellent operational record." Sarah studied the team more closely. 5 of the 6 men were handling the stress well, maintaining focus and communication despite the instructor's attempts to distract them. But the 6th man, a tall blonde with sergeant stripes, was showing signs of psychological fatigue that concerned her. "The blonde sergeant," she said quietly to Captain Morrison. "He's compensating for something. His physical performance is excellent, but he's working too hard to maintain his mental composure." Lieutenant Commander Davis followed her gaze. "That's Sergeant Mike Thompson. He's one of our most reliable operators. I'm not sure what you're seeing, but his record is spotless." Sarah continued watching as the exercise intensified. Sergeant Thompson's technique remained flawless, but she could see micro-expressions of anxiety that he was successfully hiding from his teammates and instructors. He's afraid of appearing weak in front of the others. That fear is driving him to overperform, which actually makes him more vulnerable to psychological manipulation. As if summoned by their conversation, the team completed their exercise and began moving toward the equipment storage area. The instructor, a grizzled chief petty officer with 20 years of experience, approached Captain Morrison with obvious respect. "Captain, Team 7 just completed the tactical reasoning exercise in record time." Thompson led the problem-solving effort and kept the team focused throughout. Sarah watched Sergeant Thompson as the instructor praised his performance. She saw a brief flash of relief cross his face, quickly replaced by the stoic expression expected of elite warriors. That moment of vulnerability told her everything she needed to know about his psychological makeup. "Chief Martinez, I'd like you to meet Ms. Martinez," Captain Morrison said, introducing Sarah to the instructor. "She's consulting with us on advanced psychological resistance training." Chief Martinez looked Sarah up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Ma'am, with respect, these men have already been through the most comprehensive psychological training in the military. I'm not sure what else they could need." Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant Thompson and his team approached. Thompson's eyes met Sarah's briefly, and she saw him instinctively assess her as a potential threat or asset. His evaluation was quick but thorough, exactly what she would expect from a professional soldier. "Chief, is there a problem?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to command respect. "No problem, Sergeant. Just introducing our visitor." Chief Martinez gestured toward Sarah. "This is Ms. Martinez. She's here to observe our training methods." Thompson nodded politely, but Sarah caught something else in his expression. Curiosity mixed with wariness, and underneath it all, that same fear of inadequacy she had observed during the exercise. She realized that this man, despite his obvious competence and strength, carried psychological burdens that could be exploited by a skilled enemy. "Ms. Martinez," Captain Morrison said, "would you like to explain to the team what type of training you specialize in?" Sarah looked at each of the 6 SEALs in turn, reading their personalities and potential vulnerabilities with practiced ease. "I teach resistance to psychological manipulation techniques that go beyond traditional interrogation methods. The kind of mental warfare that targets your core identity and deepest fears rather than just trying to extract information." One of the other team members, a compact Hispanic man with corporal stripes, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've already been trained to resist interrogation. We know how to handle physical and psychological pressure." "Corporal Rodriguez is right," Thompson added. "We've been through SEER school and advanced resistance training. What could you teach us that we don't already know?" Sarah smiled slightly, recognizing the challenge in their voices. "May I ask you a question, Sergeant Thompson? What's your greatest fear?" Thompson's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "I don't have fears that affect my operational capability, ma'am." "Everyone has fears," Sarah replied calmly. "The difference is whether you control them or they control you. Traditional resistance training teaches you to endure physical pain and resist standard interrogation techniques. But modern psychological warfare doesn't rely on pain or conventional questioning." She moved closer to the team, her voice remaining conversational, but carrying an undertone of authority that made them unconsciously lean in to listen. "Instead, it identifies what you care about most deeply and threatens that. It finds the story you tell yourself about who you are and systematically destroys that story." Lieutenant Commander Davis shifted uncomfortably. "Can you be more specific about these techniques?" Sarah considered how much she could reveal in front of the SEALs. Imagine an interrogator who doesn't ask you for information at all. Instead, he shows you video of your family and explains in detail how he's going to destroy their lives unless you betray your mission. Not kill them. That would make you a hero. Instead, he threatens to frame them for crimes, destroy their reputations, ensure they live in shame and poverty for the rest of their lives. The team exchanged glances, clearly understanding the psychological impact of such a threat. Thompson's jaw tightened slightly, confirming Sarah's assessment that family was indeed one of his core vulnerabilities. Or, Sarah continued, imagine an interrogator who doesn't threaten anyone. Instead, he convinces you that your entire mission is based on false information, that the people you're trying to save are actually the enemy, and the people you're fighting are innocent victims of government propaganda. He provides seemingly credible evidence, fake documents, staged videos, false testimony from people you trust. Chief Martinez frowned. Our men are trained to verify information and maintain mission focus regardless of enemy deception. Are they? Sarah asked. Sergeant Thompson, if you discovered with absolute certainty that your current mission involved killing innocent civilians, what would you do? Thompson didn't hesitate. I would refuse to carry out the mission and report the situation to my commanding officer. Good answer, Sarah said. But what if the evidence came from your commanding officer? What if Captain Morrison himself showed you video proof that your target was actually a humanitarian relief worker and ordered you to stand down? Thompson glanced at Captain Morrison, clearly uncomfortable with the hypothetical scenario. I would need to verify the information through independent sources. And if those independent sources confirmed the information? If everyone you trusted told you the same thing? Sarah pressed. The SEAL's confidence began to waver slightly. I would have to reassess the situation. Sarah nodded. And, in that moment of uncertainty, when everything you believed about your mission and your purpose was called into question, you would be psychologically vulnerable in ways that traditional resistance training never prepared you for. Corporal Rodriguez stepped forward. But, eventually we would figure out the truth. We're not easily fooled. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. But, eventually might be too late. Modern psychological warfare isn't designed to permanently deceive you. It's designed to create temporary confusion and hesitation at critical moments. 5 minutes of uncertainty during a crucial operation can be enough to achieve the enemy's objectives. Captain Morrison had been listening intently to the conversation. Ms. Martinez, can you give us an example of how your training would address these vulnerabilities? Sarah looked at Sergeant Thompson again, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate her methods. Sergeant, would you be willing to participate in a brief exercise? Thompson straightened, his competitive instincts clearly engaged. Yes, ma'am. I want you to tell me about someone you care about. It can be family, a friend, anyone whose welfare matters to you. Thompson hesitated, his training warning him against revealing personal information. Ma'am, I don't think that's appropriate. That's exactly the point, Sarah said. Your instinct is to protect that information because you know it could be used against you. But what if protecting it actually made you more vulnerable? She turned to address the entire group. Traditional security thinking says to compartmentalize personal information and never reveal weaknesses. But psychological warfare specialists know that the things you're most desperate to hide are often the things that control you most completely. Chief Martinez crossed his arms. So you're saying we should tell our enemies about our families and fears? I'm saying you should confront those fears until they lose their power over you, Sarah replied. When you're no longer afraid of your fear being discovered, that fear can't be used to control you. Thompson looked puzzled. How do you confront a fear of losing someone you love? You can't just stop caring about them. You can't stop caring, Sarah agreed. But you can stop being paralyzed by the possibility of loss. You can develop the mental strength to act effectively even while experiencing that fear. She moved to the center of the group, her voice taking on the tone of an experienced instructor. My training methods expose you to psychological pressure in controlled doses, similar to how physical training exposes your muscles to stress to make them stronger. But instead of lifting weights, we lift psychological burdens until you can carry them without being crushed. Lieutenant Commander Davis looked concerned. That sounds potentially traumatic. It can be, Sarah acknowledged. Which is why participation is always voluntary and why not everyone chooses to complete the program. But for those who do, the benefits are extraordinary. Sergeant Thompson had been thinking about her words, and now he stepped forward again. Ma'am, if you were to train our team, what exactly would that involve? Sarah met his eyes, recognizing the moment when curiosity overcame caution. For you specifically, Sergeant, we would start by identifying what you're most afraid of losing or being. Then, we would systematically expose you to scenarios where those fears become reality, in a safe environment where you could learn to function despite the psychological pain. And You think this would make me a better soldier? I think it would make you a more complete human being who happens to be a soldier, Sarah replied. Right now, you're strong everywhere except in a few specific areas that you've learned to avoid thinking about. My training eliminates those blind spots. Captain Morrison stepped forward. I think we've heard enough for today. Ms. Martinez, thank you for the demonstration. We'll discuss your proposal and get back to you within 48 hours. As the group began to disperse, Sergeant Thompson lingered for a moment. Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something? Of course. Have you been through this training yourself? Sarah smiled sadly. Twice, Sergeant. Once as a student, once as an instructor training other instructors. Both experiences changed me permanently. For the better? She considered the question carefully. That depends on what you value more, comfortable illusions or uncomfortable truth. The training strips away a lot of the mental structures that most people use to feel safe and normal. Some people find freedom in that. Others find it lonely. Thompson nodded slowly. Thank you for being honest. As he walked away to rejoin his team, Sarah realized that she had just planted seeds that would either grow into something extraordinary or create complications she wasn't prepared to handle. Either way, there was no going back now. 3 days later, Sarah received the call she had been expecting. Captain Morrison's voice was formal but carried an undertone of nervous anticipation. Ms. Martinez, we've decided to move forward with your training proposal. Team 7 has volunteered for the program. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and dread settle in her stomach. All 6 members volunteered, sir. Actually, 5 members volunteered immediately. Sergeant Thompson requested additional time to consider the decision, but ultimately chose to participate as well. That didn't surprise Sarah. Thompson struck her as someone who would carefully weigh the risks before committing to something as psychologically intensive as her training program. His caution was actually a good sign. It meant he understood the seriousness of what he was agreeing to undertake. When would you like to begin? She asked. Monday morning, 0800 hours. We've arranged for you to use Training Facility Delta, which offers complete privacy and sound isolation. The team will be excused from all other duties for the duration of your program. Sarah made notes as Captain Morrison spoke. Sir, I'll need to review each team member's psychological profile and medical history before we begin. Also, I want to emphasize again that any team member can withdraw at any time without penalty or explanation. Understood. Lieutenant Commander Davis will provide you with the necessary files tomorrow. Is there anything else you need? Sarah hesitated, knowing that her next request might sound strange. I need permission to bring some specialized equipment. Audio and video recording devices, some items that might look like interrogation tools, and materials for creating realistic psychological scenarios. What kind of scenarios? That depends on what we discovered during the initial assessment phase. But I can tell you that some of the exercises will involve simulating the psychological pressure techniques used by hostile interrogators. The team needs to experience these methods in a controlled environment before encountering them in the field. Captain Morrison was quiet for a moment. Ms. Martinez, I need your word that no permanent psychological damage will be done to these men. You have it, sir. But I also need you to understand that change isn't the same as damage. These men will be different when the training is complete. In most cases, they'll be stronger and more resilient. But they'll also see the world differently, and some find that adjustment difficult. I'll trust your judgment. Good luck, Ms. Martinez. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her hotel room overlooking San Diego Bay and began planning the training program that would consume the next month of her life. Each SEAL would require a customized approach based on his individual psychological profile, but certain elements would be consistent across all participants. The first phase would involve assessment and preparation. She would spend individual time with each team member, identifying their core fears, psychological vulnerabilities, and mental defense mechanisms. This phase was crucial because the entire program would be built around the specific weaknesses discovered during these initial sessions. The second phase would involve controlled exposure to psychological pressure. Working with each SEAL individually and then, as a team, she would simulate various forms of mental manipulation and observe their responses. This was where most withdrawals occurred, as participants realized exactly how psychologically invasive the training would become. The third phase was breakdown and reconstruction. This was the most dangerous part of the program, where she would systematically attack each participant's psychological defenses until they experienced complete mental vulnerability. Only then could she teach them to rebuild those defenses in a way that couldn't be easily compromised. The final phase involved integration and testing. Participants would face increasingly sophisticated psychological challenges designed to verify that their new mental defenses could withstand real-world pressure. By the end of this phase, they would be essentially immune to psychological manipulation of any kind. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Sarah's mood as she drove onto the naval base. She had spent the previous day reviewing the psychological profiles of Team 7, and what she had discovered both impressed and concerned her. All 6 men were exceptional soldiers with outstanding operational records, but each carried psychological burdens that could potentially be exploited by skilled interrogators. Sergeant Thompson's fear of inadequacy was just one example. Corporal Rodriguez struggled with guilt over civilian casualties from a previous deployment. Another team member had never fully processed the death of his father. A fourth had deep-seated authority issues masked by perfect military discipline. These weren't weaknesses in the traditional sense. They were normal human responses to extraordinary circumstances. But, in the wrong hands, they could become weapons turned against the men who carried them. Training Facility Delta was located in an isolated section of the base, designed for exercises that required absolute privacy. The building was windowless and soundproof, with multiple rooms that could be configured for various training scenarios. Sarah spent Saturday afternoon setting up her equipment and preparing the spaces she would use over the next month. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Sarah was already in the facility when Team 7 arrived at exactly 0800 hours. The 6 SEALs entered together, their unity and mutual support obvious in their synchronized movements and shared glances. They were dressed in standard training gear, but Sarah noticed that each man carried himself slightly differently than he had during their first meeting. Sergeant Thompson looked more serious, as if the weight of his decision to participate was finally sinking in. Corporal Rodriguez appeared nervous but determined. The others showed various degrees of curiosity and apprehension. All of them looked at Sarah with new attention, recognizing that she was no longer just an observer, but someone who would be intimately involved in their psychological development. "Good morning, gentlemen," Sarah said, standing in the center of the main training room. "Before we begin, I want to establish some ground rules that will govern our work together over the next month." She gestured for them to sit in the chairs arranged in a circle. "First, everything that happens in this facility is confidential. Nothing discussed here will be reported to your superiors unless it involves immediate danger to yourself or others. Second, any team member can withdraw from the program at any time without explanation or penalty. Third, the training will sometimes require you to share personal information that you've never told anyone. This information will be used only to help you develop psychological resistance." The team exchanged glances, clearly beginning to understand the intensity of what they had committed to. Sarah continued, "Fourth, there will be times when you hate me, when you think I'm deliberately trying to harm you psychologically, when you question whether this training is worth the emotional pain. Those feelings are normal and expected. They're also signs that the training is working." Sergeant Thompson raised his hand. "Ma'am, what if we discover that one of us can't handle the psychological pressure? What happens to the rest of the team?" "Good question. The training is designed so that each person progresses at his own pace. If someone withdraws, the others continue. If someone needs additional time to process a particular exercise, we accommodate that. The goal isn't to break anyone. It's to build psychological strength." Sarah moved to a whiteboard and drew a simple diagram. Traditional military training assumes that psychological strength comes from discipline and willpower. You learn to suppress fear, doubt, and other negative emotions through mental toughness and unit cohesion. She drew arrows pointing from various emotion words toward a central box labeled Mission Focus. This approach works well in most situations, but it creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by enemies who understand psychology better than tactics. She erased part of the diagram and redrew it differently. "My training teaches you to acknowledge and work with negative emotions rather than suppressing them. You learn to maintain mission effectiveness even while experiencing fear, doubt, guilt, or anger. One of the team members, a quiet SEAL named Williams, spoke up. "Ma'am, that sounds like you're teaching us to be weaker, not stronger." "I understand why it might seem that way," Sarah replied. "But consider this. Which is stronger? A wall that breaks when enough pressure is applied, or a wall that bends with pressure but never breaks?" She moved closer to the team, her voice taking on the intensity of someone who had experienced what she was describing. Suppressing emotions requires constant mental energy. When you're under extreme stress for extended periods, that energy gets depleted. Eventually, the suppression fails, and all those emotions come flooding back at once. Corporal Rodriguez nodded slowly, like what happened to Martinez during the Lebanon deployment. He held everything together for months, then had a complete breakdown during a routine patrol. "Exactly," Sarah said. "What I'm going to teach you is how to process those emotions as they occur, so they never build up to dangerous levels. You'll learn to function effectively while experiencing the full range of human feelings." Sergeant Thompson looked skeptical. "Ma'am, emotions can be distracting. In combat situations, we can't afford to be distracted by feelings." "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed. "Which is why you're going to learn to experience emotions without being distracted by them. Think of it like learning to hear gunfire without flinching. The sound still registers, but it doesn't interfere with your ability to function." She moved to another part of the room where she had set up a table with various items covered by a black cloth. "We're going to start with individual assessment sessions. Each of you will spend one-on-one time with me over the next 3 days while I identify your specific psychological profile and vulnerabilities." Sarah pulled away the cloth, revealing an assortment of objects that looked like a cross between psychological testing materials and interrogation tools. There were photographs, audio equipment, various props, and items that clearly had no obvious purpose. "Some of these assessments will be uncomfortable," she continued. "I'm going to ask you personal questions, show you disturbing images, and create situations designed to trigger emotional responses. The purpose isn't to hurt you. It's to map your psychological landscape, so I can design training that addresses your specific needs." The team members stared at the collection of items with varying degrees of unease. Williams raised his hand again. "What happens if we discover that one of us has psychological problems that affect our operational capability?" Sarah had been dreading this question. "That depends on the nature and severity of the problems. Minor issues that can be addressed through training will remain confidential. Major issues that could endanger the team or mission effectiveness will need to be reported." She paused, making eye contact with each team member. "But I want you to understand something important. Having psychological vulnerabilities doesn't make you weak or unfit for duty. It makes you human. The goal of this training is to transform those vulnerabilities into strengths." Sergeant Thompson stood up. "Ma'am, I'd like to volunteer to go first." Sarah wasn't surprised. Thompson's leadership instincts would compel him to face the unknown threat before asking his teammates to do the same. "Very well, Sergeant. The rest of you are dismissed until tomorrow morning. Use this time to mentally prepare yourselves and consider anything you might want to discuss with me privately." As the other 5 team members filed out of the facility, Thompson remained standing in the center of the room. Sarah could see the tension in his posture, the way he held himself ready for whatever was coming next. "Are you ready to begin, Sergeant?" she asked. Thompson met her eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had faced death and decided that psychological discomfort was a manageable risk. "Yes, ma'am. Let's see what you've got." Sarah smiled grimly, knowing that within the next hour, Sergeant Mike Thompson would understand exactly what he had signed up for, and whether he had the strength to see it through to the end. Sarah led Sergeant Thompson to a smaller room adjacent to the main training area. The space was deliberately designed to feel clinical and slightly unsettling. White walls, minimal furniture, and recording equipment that suggested interrogation rather than therapy. She had found that creating mild psychological discomfort from the beginning helped participants understand the seriousness of what they were undertaking. "Please have a seat, Sergeant," Sarah said, gesturing to a metal chair positioned across from her own. "Before we begin the formal assessment, I want you to understand what's going to happen over the next several hours." Thompson sat down, his military bearing intact, but his eyes showing wariness. "I'm listening, ma'am." I'm going to ask you questions that will seem intrusive and inappropriate. I'm going to show you images and play recordings designed to trigger emotional responses. Most importantly, I'm going to push against your psychological defenses until I find the places where they're weakest. Sarah opened a thick folder containing Thompson's military records, psychological evaluations, and personal information gathered from security clearance investigations. I already know quite a bit about your background, but that information only tells me what you've done, not who you are underneath the uniform. Thompson shifted slightly in his chair. What kind of questions are we talking about? Questions about your family, your fears, your failures, your regrets. Questions about times when you felt powerless or ashamed or terrified. Questions about the people you've killed and whether you enjoyed it. Thompson's expression hardened. Ma'am, I don't enjoy killing. I do what's necessary to complete the mission and protect my team. That's a good, professional answer, Sarah replied. But it's also exactly the kind of response that tells me you've never really examined your feelings about taking human life. That unexplored emotional territory is where vulnerabilities hide. She picked up a digital tablet and swiped to a series of photographs. I want you to look at these images and tell me what you feel when you see them. The first photograph showed a bombed-out building in what appeared to be a Middle Eastern city. Bodies were visible among the rubble, including what might have been children. Thompson looked at the image steadily, his face showing no emotion. I see the aftermath of an explosion, probably from an IED or airstrike, he said calmly. Civilian casualties in an urban combat environment. What do you feel when you look at it? I feel nothing specific. It's unfortunate that civilians were killed, but this is what war looks like. Sarah made notes on her tablet. Nothing specific. Interesting phrase. What would you feel if you discovered that your team had been responsible for this particular explosion? Thompson's composure slipped slightly. We would never target civilians intentionally. I didn't ask what you would do. I asked what you would feel. Thompson was quiet for a long moment. I would feel responsible. Guilty, I suppose. Even if the explosion was necessary to complete your mission? Yes. Even if failing to act would have resulted in the deaths of your teammates? Thompson's hands clenched slightly. Yes, I would still feel guilty about the civilian casualties. Sarah made more notes, already beginning to map the contours of Thompson's psychological landscape. His primary vulnerability wasn't fear of physical harm or even fear of death. It was fear of being responsible for unnecessary suffering. This was both a strength and a weakness, making him a more ethical soldier, but also giving potential interrogators a lever to use against him. She swiped to the next image, which showed a military funeral. Uniformed soldiers were carrying a flag-draped coffin, while a woman in black clothing wept nearby. Tell me about this image. Thompson's voice became quieter. Military funeral. The deceased's family is grieving. Have you attended funerals like this one? Yes, ma'am. For people you served with? Yes. Sarah watched his face carefully. For people who died because of decisions you made? Thompson's jaw tightened. Ma'am, I don't see how that's relevant to psychological resistance training. It's relevant because an enemy interrogator would ask you the same question, except he would already know the answer. He would know about Staff Sergeant Williams who died in Afghanistan because you called for close air support 30 seconds too late. He would know about Corporal Martinez who bled out in Iraq while you were focused on the primary objective instead of casualty evacuation. Thompson shot to his feet, his professional composure finally cracking. How do you know about those operations? That information is classified. Sarah remained seated, her voice calm, but relentless. I know because understanding your psychological vulnerabilities requires understanding your history. An enemy interrogator would know these details too, and he would use them to convince you that you're responsible for your teammates' deaths. I am responsible, Thompson said, his voice raw with suppressed emotion. If I had acted faster, made better decisions, those men would still be alive. Are you? Sarah asked. Or are you carrying guilt that belongs to the enemy fighters who created the situations that killed your friends? Thompson began pacing the small room. They died under my command. The responsibility is mine. Sergeant, sit down. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and Thompson automatically responded to it. What I just did to you is a mild example of the psychological manipulation you'll face from sophisticated interrogators. Thompson sat down slowly, his hands shaking slightly. What do you mean? I used information about your past to trigger feelings of guilt and self-doubt. Then, I pushed those feelings until you began questioning your own judgment and taking responsibility for things that weren't your fault. In a real interrogation situation, an enemy would continue this process until you were psychologically broken. She leaned forward in her chair. Right now, you're feeling exposed and manipulated because I forced you to confront emotions you usually suppress. That discomfort is exactly what we need to work with. Thompson took a deep breath, visibly trying to regain his composure. So what happens now? Now we dig deeper. The assessment phase isn't just about identifying your vulnerabilities. It's about understanding how those vulnerabilities control your behavior and decision-making. Sarah picked up a different folder, this one containing personal information that had nothing to do with Thompson's military service. Tell me about your father. Thompson's expression became guarded again. He's retired. Lives in Ohio with my mother. What did he do for work? He was a police officer for 30 years. Did he approve of your decision to join the military? Thompson hesitated. He wanted me to follow him into law enforcement. So he disapproved? He said the military would make me into a killer instead of someone who protects people. Sarah made notes, seeing another piece of Thompson's psychological puzzle fall into place. Is that why you joined the SEALs specifically? To prove that you could be both a warrior and a protector? Thompson's silence was answer enough. And when your teammates die under your command, you hear your father's voice telling you that you've become exactly what he feared, someone who causes death instead of preventing it. Thompson's hands clenched into fists. That's enough. We're just getting started, Sarah replied. An enemy interrogator wouldn't stop there. He would continue until you began questioning everything you believe about yourself and your purpose. She stood up and moved to the wall, where she activated a video screen. I'm going to show you a recording now. It's going to be disturbing, and it's designed to trigger specific emotional responses. I want you to watch it and tell me what you feel. The video began playing, showing what appeared to be a hostage situation. A man in military fatigues, someone who looked remarkably similar to Thompson, was pointing a weapon at a group of civilians, including women and children. The civilians were crying and begging for their lives in a language Thompson didn't recognize. This is fake, Thompson said immediately. How do you know? The uniform is wrong, the weapon handling is wrong. The entire scenario is obviously staged. Sarah paused the video. You're absolutely right. But imagine if it wasn't obviously fake. Imagine if it was professionally produced, with perfect uniforms and realistic dialogue. Imagine if an interrogator showed you this video and claimed it was footage of you from a classified operation you don't remember. Thompson stared at the frozen image on the screen. I would know it wasn't real. Would you? Memory is surprisingly unreliable under extreme stress. There are documented cases of soldiers being convinced they committed atrocities they never actually performed, simply because they were shown convincing false evidence while psychologically vulnerable. Sarah turned off the video and returned to her seat. The point of this exercise isn't to convince you that fake evidence is real. It's to show you how psychological manipulation works and how it can be used against people who haven't been specifically trained to resist it. Thompson rubbed his temples, clearly experiencing the mental fatigue that came from constant psychological pressure. How long does this assessment continue? We're about halfway through. Are you ready to continue? Or do you need a break? Thompson straightened in his chair, his military discipline reasserting itself. I can handle whatever you throw at me, ma'am. Sarah smiled grimly. We'll see, Sergeant. We'll see. She picked up another folder, this one containing photographs that she had specifically prepared for Thompson based on her analysis of his psychological profile. The next phase of the assessment would push him toward his breaking point, not to destroy him, but to show him exactly where that breaking point was located. Let's talk about your deepest fear, Sarah said, opening the folder. Not your fear of failing your team or disappointing your father. Your real fear, the one you've never admitted to anyone, possibly including yourself. Thompson's face went pale as Sarah laid the first photograph on the table between them. It showed a man in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes, his face gaunt and his eyes empty of recognition. Your grandfather, Sarah said quietly. Alzheimer's disease. You visited him every week for 2 years. watching one of the strongest men you ever knew disappear piece by piece until he didn't remember your name. Thompson's hands began to shake. How did you? Your greatest fear isn't death, Sergeant. It's losing yourself while still being alive. It's becoming someone you don't recognize, someone who can't control his own actions or protect the people he cares about. Sarah laid down a second photograph, this one showing Thompson himself, but digitally altered to show him looking confused and disoriented. What would you do if you began experiencing memory loss? What if you started forgetting critical details during operations? What if you could no longer trust your own judgment? Thompson was breathing heavily now, his professional composure completely shattered. Stop. Just stop. I can't stop, Sergeant, because an enemy interrogator won't stop. He'll continue pushing until you break. And then, he'll use your fear to control you. Sarah leaned across the table. But here's what he won't tell you, and what you need to understand. Fear loses its power when you face it directly. Your grandfather's disease was terrible, but it doesn't define your fate. Your identity is stronger than your memory, and your character is more than your mental capacity. Thompson was staring at the altered photograph of himself, tears streaming down his face. I can't handle the thought of becoming helpless like that. You don't have to handle it, Sarah said gently. You just have to stop running from it. Fear is like quicksand. The more you struggle against it, the deeper it pulls you down. But if you relax and face it calmly, you can find solid ground. She gathered up the photographs and put them back in the folder. That's enough for today. Go back to your quarters, get some rest, and process what we've discovered. Tomorrow, we'll start working on building your resistance to these psychological pressure points. Thompson stood up slowly, looking emotionally drained, but somehow also relieved. Ma'am, will the training get easier from here? Sarah met his eyes with compassion, but also complete honesty. No, Sergeant. It's going to get much harder before it gets easier. But I promise you this. If you stick with the program, you'll come out stronger than you ever imagined possible. As Thompson left the assessment room, Sarah began preparing for the next day's session. She had successfully mapped his primary psychological vulnerabilities, but the real work was just beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, she would systematically expose him to his deepest fears until they lost their power to control him. Whether he would have the strength to endure that process remained to be seen. 3 weeks into the program, Sarah stood in the main training facility watching Team 7 complete their final psychological resistance exercise. Of the 6 SEALs who had begun the training, 4 remained. Corporal Rodriguez had withdrawn after the second week when the family-focused scenarios became too intense. Williams had lasted until the 3rd week before deciding that the psychological cost wasn't worth the potential benefits. But the 4 who remained had been transformed in ways that even Sarah found remarkable. Sergeant Thompson stood in the center of the room, calmly fielding increasingly sophisticated psychological attacks from multiple directions while maintaining perfect mission focus. The man who had broken down during his initial assessment was now demonstrating psychological resilience that exceeded anything Sarah had seen in her years of conducting this training. Thompson, your wife is in our custody, one of Sarah's assistant instructors called out, playing the role of an enemy interrogator. We've shown her the video of you killing those children in Somalia. She knows what kind of monster you really are. 3 weeks ago, such a statement would have triggered visible distress in Thompson. Now, he simply processed the information and responded with practiced calm. My wife knows my character better than some fictional interrogator ever could. Next question. Your team is dead because you led them into an ambush. You're responsible for their deaths. If my team is dead, then my responsibility is to complete the mission in their honor. Next question. Sarah felt a mixture of professional pride and personal sadness as she watched the exercise continue. These men had indeed become nearly immune to psychological manipulation, but the process had changed them in ways that went beyond simple resilience. They had learned to compartmentalize their emotions so effectively that some human connections would never feel quite the same again. The exercise concluded with all 4 remaining team members successfully resisting 2 hours of intensive psychological pressure without breaking. Sarah called them together in the center of the room for their final debrief. Gentlemen, you've completed the most intensive psychological resistance training program in the world. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. Thompson spoke for the group. Ma'am, we appreciate what you've taught us. But I have to ask, was it worth what we've lost? Sarah had been expecting this question. It was asked by every group that completed her training. What do you feel you've lost, Sergeant? I used to worry about my family. Now I know that worry was a weakness, and I've eliminated it. But I also used to feel joy when I thought about them. That's gone too. The other 3 team members nodded in agreement. Sarah could see the same realization in their faces. They had gained extraordinary psychological strength, but at the cost of some emotional depth that they would never recover. That's a normal part of the process, Sarah explained. You've learned to regulate your emotions so effectively that both positive and negative feelings are muted. For most people, this levels out over time, and you'll find yourself capable of joy again, just not the kind of desperate happiness that can be taken away by threats. She moved to the whiteboard where she had first explained her training methods. You asked if it was worth it. I can't answer that for you. But I can tell you that you're now prepared for psychological warfare that would break 99% of people, including your previous selves. One of the other team members, Petty Officer Johnson, raised his hand. Ma'am, what happens to people who don't complete the training? Rodriguez and Williams, will they be okay? They'll be fine, Sarah assured him. The training only becomes permanently life-changing if you complete the full program. Rodriguez and Williams experienced some psychological discomfort, but they'll recover completely within a few weeks. Thompson looked thoughtful. So we're the ones who chose to be permanently changed. You chose to eliminate psychological vulnerabilities that could have been used against you by enemies who understand the human mind better than most soldiers understand tactics. Whether that was worth the trade-off is a decision only you can make. As Sarah began packing up her equipment, she reflected on the month that had just concluded. Team 7's graduation rate of 67% was actually above average for her training program. Most groups saw closer to 50% completion, and some had been as low as 30%. Captain Morrison entered the facility as Sarah was loading her gear into storage cases. His expression was carefully neutral, which usually meant he had mixed feelings about the results. Ms. Martinez, how would you assess the program's success? Sarah paused in her packing. The 4 men who completed the training are now essentially immune to psychological manipulation of any kind. They'll be incredibly valuable assets in situations involving capture, interrogation, or psychological warfare. And the 2 who withdrew? Corporal Rodriguez made the right decision for himself. His psychological profile included trauma responses that would have made the full training extremely difficult without potentially causing lasting damage. Williams simply decided that the personal cost wasn't worth the professional benefits. Captain Morrison nodded. And Thompson? He was our primary concern going into this. Sarah looked across the room to where Sergeant Thompson was helping his teammates organize their gear. Thompson is remarkable. He not only completed the training, but excelled in ways I rarely see. He's developed psychological resilience that will serve him well for the rest of his life. But Sarah heard the concern in Captain Morrison's voice. But he's also lost some of his emotional responsiveness. He'll be a more effective soldier and a more difficult man to love. His relationships may suffer. Captain Morrison was quiet for a moment. Do you think he would make the same choice if he could do it over again? Ask him in 6 months, Sarah replied. Right now, he's still processing the changes. In 6 months, he'll have a better sense of how the training has affected his overall quality of life. As Sarah finished packing her equipment, Sergeant Thompson approached her. His demeanor was professional, but warmer than she had expected from someone who had just completed her emotionally intensive training program. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you've taught us. You don't need to thank me, Sergeant. You did the hard work. Thompson smiled slightly. I also wanted to ask you something. During the training, you mentioned that you've been through this program twice. What was that like for you? Sarah had been dreading this conversation, but she owed him an honest answer. The first time, as a student, it saved my life. I was captured during a classified operation and spent 6 days being interrogated by people who used every technique I've taught you. Without the training, they would have broken me completely. And the second time, as an instructor learning to train others, it nearly destroyed my ability to form close relationships. I gained the skills to teach psychological resilience, but I lost most of my capacity for emotional intimacy. Thompson studied her face. Do you regret it? Sarah considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. But I don't regret having the ability to help people like you develop strength you didn't know you could possess. As Thompson rejoined his team, Sarah realized that her work at Naval Base Coronado was essentially complete. The program had been successful by any objective measure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been lost in the process of making these exceptional men even more exceptional. 2 hours later, she was driving away from the base when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Captain Morrison's number. Ms. Martinez, we've just received orders deploying Team 7 to a classified operation in Eastern Europe. Intelligence suggests they may face exactly the type of psychological warfare your training was designed to counter. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of pride and anxiety. How long until deployment? 72 hours. I wanted you to know that your training may be tested under real-world conditions very soon. After ending the call, Sarah pulled over and sat in her car for several minutes, thinking about the 4 men she had just spent a month teaching to face their deepest fears. In 3 days, they would be putting those skills to use in an environment where failure could mean not just personal breakdown, but mission failure and potentially the loss of innocent lives. She had given them the psychological tools to survive whatever their enemies might throw at them. Whether those tools would be enough, and whether the men would still be themselves when they returned, remained to be seen. As she resumed driving, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if she had created 4 nearly invulnerable soldiers, or if she had simply replaced 4 human beings with highly effective machines. The answer to that question would ultimately determine whether her life's work was a contribution to human strength or a subtle form of destruction disguised as training. 6 months later, she would receive a letter from Sergeant Thompson that would finally provide that answer. But for now, all she could do was hope that the strength she had helped them build would be enough to preserve not just their lives, but their humanity as well. The letter would be brief but profound. Ms. Martinez, I wanted you to know that your training saved not just my life, but the lives of 12 hostages who would have died if I had broken under interrogation. The personal costs you warned us about were real, but so were the benefits. I still struggle with emotional connections, but I've learned that strength and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. Thank you for showing us that we could be more than we thought possible. Until then, Sarah would carry the weight of wondering whether she had done the right thing, whether the price of psychological invulnerability was worth paying, and whether the 4 men she had trained would emerge from their deployment as the heroes she hoped they could become, or as the emotionally damaged warriors she feared they might have to be.